The morning rain had broken before sunrise, leaving the runway at Henderson Field slick with the brown sheen of volcanic silt. A line of seabees stood waist-deep in the tide near Vella La Vella, winching the carcass of a plane out of the mangrove shallows. Its wings drooped like soaked linen. The tropical air smelled of fuel and salt. From the bluff above, I watched the wreckage move slowly. Unevenly, its green fuselage emerging from the mud like the back of some drowned leviathan. The Japanese rising sun still faintly showed on the tail, half-eaten by corrosion. Someone shouted for the cable to tighten. The winch motor strained, coughed, and the plane slid forward another few yards before settling in the sand with a hollow thud. The seabees, sunburned and mud-streaked, were joking about souvenirs, control yokes, gauges, even a fragment of the canopy. None of them knew it yet, but this was no ordinary wreck. It was a Mitsubishi G4M, the bomber the Japanese called the Ishikiriko, the Type 1 attack bomber. We called it something else, Betty. By mid-afternoon, the hulk sat at the edge of the airfield, propped on timber supports. 2 ordnance men circled it like cautious surgeons. Its twin engines were intact, propellers bent but not shattered. The tail section had been torn off in the crash, yet the central fuselage was remarkably whole. Burn marks traced the starboard wing where the fuel had ignited. Inside the cockpit, the canopy glass was fused by heat. When I climbed up the side ladder, the smell of scorched aluminum and rubber filled the air. Japanese script still marked the throttle quadrant, the levers capped with small red knobs. A map half burned, edges curling lay wedged behind the navigator's seat. Lieutenant Harlan from Ordnance was already inside with a flashlight, taking notes on a clipboard. He looked up briefly. "Never seen anything like it," he said. "No armor behind the pilot's seat. None. Just sheet metal." I leaned closer, tracing a finger along the edge of a torn panel. The metal was thin, shockingly thin. You could flex it with a thumb. "No self-sealing compound either," Harlan continued. "You hit one of these and she goes up like a lantern." He meant it literally. The next morning, the technical crews arrived, men from 13 Fighter Command, mechanics from the 339th Squadron, and a few Navy aviation engineers flown in from Espiritu Santo. They formed a rough semicircle around the Betty while a photographer documented every angle. Captain Raymond, head of engineering, walked slow circuits around the wreck, chewing the stem of a pipe. He stopped at the port wing, tapped the fuel line with a wrench, and looked at me. "Unprotected tanks," he muttered. "Wide open." That phrase would echo through every report we wrote for weeks. Unprotected fuel tanks. He had a copy of the preliminary technical bulletin from the Air Technical Intelligence Unit. It listed the Betty's known specifications: range, armament, top speed. What it didn't explain was why a nation capable of designing the Zero fighter would leave its main bomber so vulnerable. Raymond turned to one of the P-38 pilots watching nearby, a lieutenant named Connors who'd flown escort missions over New Georgia. "Tell me," Raymond asked, "you ever go up against one of these?" Connors nodded. "Couple months back, over Bougainville. We hit 2 of them. One pass was enough. They didn't even have time to dive." He paused, his gaze fixed on the shattered canopy. "Now I know why." Someone mentioned Yamamoto's plane, the one shot down in April during Operation Vengeance. The comparison was inevitable. The same type of bomber, the same weaknesses. I had read the debriefing reports, Lanphier and Barber describing how the Admiral's plane flamed instantly when struck. The wreckage now sitting before us seemed to confirm every word. We began cataloguing the interior. Every gauge was photographed, every switch tagged. The fuselage bore bullet punctures, but few of them had penetrated deeply. The skin was so thin it had buckled without shattering, like foil. "Lightweight construction," one of the engineers said. "That's how they got the range. More fuel, less armor." He spoke clinically, but there was an undertone, something between admiration and disbelief. I scribbled notes as they worked. 2 Nakajima Sakai 11 radial engines, approximate range 3,000 kilometers, armament 120mm cannon, 4 7.7mm machine guns. Crew positions unarmored. Fuel tanks non-self-sealing. When I closed the notebook, the heat from the aluminum skin had already dried the sweat on my palms. That evening, a meeting was held in the operations tent. The engineers spread photographs across a wooden table. The images showed the wing cross-sections, the stripped fuselage ribs, the fuel tank's smooth, unlined metal cells built directly into the wing cavity. Raymond pointed with the stem of his pipe. There's no rubber lining, no protective coating. One hit and the vapors ignite. This isn't an oversight, it's deliberate. Someone asked the obvious question, why? A younger mechanic, barely 20, spoke up from the corner. Maybe they can't make the compound. Maybe they don't have the rubber. Raymond shook his head. They can. The Zero's tanks are self-sealing. This is a design choice. He let the silence hang there. In the background, the generators hummed, their sound mixing with the rain on the canvas roof. I watched the faces around the table, pilots, engineers, intelligence men, all staring at the photographs, as if they were looking not at machinery, but at a question about the enemy's soul. Finally, Connors said quietly, maybe they never planned to come back. No one answered. The next morning, we stripped the engines. One of the CBs found a small metal plaque riveted to the inside of the fuselage, Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, Nagoya, 1942. The letters were still sharp, untouched by corrosion. I took a photograph of it. Later that night, when the airfield went dark except for the signal lamps, I studied the print under my flashlight. I thought of the hands that had built the bomber, the men in coveralls somewhere in Nagoya, riveting thin sheets of aluminum together, knowing each plane they finished was already marked by fire. By dusk, the wreck was cordoned off with ropes and guard posts. Intelligence cables were sent to Espiritu Santo, requesting further examination. The official report would note the findings in sterile language. Fuel tanks, non-self-sealing. Armor protection, minimal. Weight reduction evidently prioritized for range performance. But in the notebook I kept for my own thoughts, I wrote something simpler. We looked inside the enemy's machine and found our reflection only thinner, lighter, and far more willing to burn. 3 days after the wreck arrived, the engineers had stripped it bare. The Betty's green skin lay in folded sheets beside the hangar, like the husks of a peeled fruit. What remained was a skeleton of aluminum ribs and spars, gleaming under the Pacific sun. The Japanese had built their bombers differently. Light, elegant, fragile. It was a machine that looked like speed, not survival. The investigation had become an obsession. Each morning I walked the perimeter of the stripped fuselage with my clipboard, following the teams as they catalogued every part. The mood was quiet, almost reverent. There was something uncomfortable about dismantling another man's work of war, especially when it was done with such precision. Captain Raymond kept a growing stack of drawings on his desk, cross-sections of wings, fuel tanks, and bulkheads. A small sign above his workspace read, "Property of X-13 Fighter Command Technical Intelligence." He tapped the end of his pencil against one of the diagrams. "Notice, here," he said, pointing to the fuel cell outline. "The tanks are integral to the wing structure. No separate bladders, no sealing compound. Every ounce saved." Lieutenant Harlan looked up from his notes. "It's brilliant and stupid at the same time." "Exactly," Raymond replied. "They traded protection for reach. You can't carry 3,000 miles of range and still expect to walk away from a gunfight." On the tarmac outside, a P-38 Lightning taxied past, its engines roaring. One of the mechanics shaded his eyes and watched it lift into the humid air. "That's what killed Yamamoto," he said softly. The name hung between us again, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, shot down in April only 4 months earlier. His plane, too, had been a Betty. His loss had shaken the Japanese Navy to its core. And now, as we examined another of his kind, the connection was impossible to ignore. That evening, I reviewed the Operation Vengeance debriefs from the 13 Fighter Command archives. Major John Mitchell's planning notes were still marked confidential. The diagrams of flight paths over Bougainville, matched the reports from the P-38 pilots. How the enemy bombers had burned almost instantly when hit. How fragments had rained into the jungle canopy. The post-action report described Yamamoto's G4M as destroyed by intense fire following a short burst from 20mm cannon. Now, looking at the stripped wreck at Henderson, the reason was plain. The fuel tanks were nothing but aluminum boxes filled with fumes. The slightest spark would have turned the plane into a torch. "Do you think they knew?" I asked Raymond that night in the mess tent. "Knew what?" "That they were flying death traps." He sipped his coffee before answering. "They knew. Pilots always know. They just don't talk about it." We received a cable from Espiritu Santo that same night, an order to preserve the wreck for possible transport to the mainland. Washington wanted data. The Technical Air Intelligence Unit needed examples of Japanese engineering to study. Somewhere in an office back home, men would pore over these fragments, learning how the enemy thought in rivets and equations. By dawn, we resumed work. The Betty's engines were hoisted onto wooden mounts. The Nakajima Sakai power plants were surprisingly clean inside. When the covers came off, the smell of burned oil filled the hangar. Sergeant Foley, one of the engine mechanics, turned a wrench slowly around a rusted bolt. "These things are built like watches," he muttered. "No armor, but damned efficient." The Japanese, we realized, had built their machines for range and endurance, not for punishment. Their bombers could reach targets far beyond anything our B-25 seconds could attempt without auxiliary tanks. That reach had made them dangerous, able to strike from Rabaul, from Bougainville, from bases we couldn't even see on our maps when the war began. Yet, for all that reach, they were glass birds. By midday, we gathered under the shade of the hangar wing for a briefing. A chalkboard listed the findings. Weight, approximately 17,000 pounds loaded. Fuel capacity, 1,500 gallons. Defensive armament. Minimal crew protection. None, Harlan tapped the final point. None. Not even behind the pilot. Yamamoto's seat was the same, Connors said from the back. He never had a chance. Raymond nodded. This isn't negligence, it's doctrine. Japanese air strategy favors offense over defense, speed and range over armor. They believed the best protection was never being caught. He turned to the engineers. Gentlemen, they were wrong. Later that afternoon, I watched the men clean the Betty's cockpit glass. Beneath the soot, the visibility was astonishing, clear, panoramic, designed for navigation across endless ocean. No metal framing blocked the view. For a moment, I could imagine sitting there, engine vibrations thrumming, through the floor, the horizon stretching forever. It struck me how human it felt, how this machine, built by enemies, carried the same fingerprints of ambition and fear as ours. The Japanese pilots had trusted it. They had flown it into battles they could not win. In the intelligence tent that night, I wrote my report. The typewriter keys clacked over the generator hum. Each paragraph was measured and factual. Subject: Mitsubishi G4M. Type 1, attack bomber, captured specimen. Serial unidentified findings indicate deliberate omission of self-sealing fuel tanks and armor plating to extend operational range to 3,000 kilometers. Aircraft therefore highly vulnerable to incendiary and tracer fire. Observed construction emphasizes performance over crew survivability, but facts alone felt inadequate. So I added a final note in pencil. The Betty is not just a bomber, it is a reflection of a nation's faith in offense, a symbol of an air force that flies further than reason allows. A few days later, a flight of PBY Catalinas arrived to ferry personnel north. As they idled on the water, one of the pilots, a Navy lieutenant, came to see the Betty before departure. He stood silently beside the fuselage for a long time, then said, "You can almost feel the ghosts in it." He was right. Every bullet hole, every scorch mark carried the memory of someone's last flight. Before nightfall, Raymond ordered the wreck covered with tarps. A storm was coming in from the west, and the Pacific light turned red as it sank behind the palms. For a brief moment, the Betty's wings glowed as if they still carried fire. That night, lying in my cot, I thought of the Japanese engineers at Nagoya, of how they must have argued the same equations we did: weight versus range, fuel versus safety, victory versus survival. And perhaps, somewhere across the sea, another man in another uniform had looked at a wrecked B-25 and asked the same question we now faced. Why do men build machines that burn so beautifully? The captured bomber had been crated and shipped north aboard a transport freighter by the time I received new orders. 13 Fighter Command wanted me at Espiritu Santo, where intelligence officers were gathering translated Japanese documents and interrogation reports from recent captures. The work was less dramatic than pulling wrecks out of the jungle, but it felt no less vital. We were trying to understand a way of thinking, not just a weapon. The interrogation compound was a cluster of Quonset huts shaded by coconut palms. The air smelled of mildew and ink. Inside, ceiling fans turned lazily above rows of typewriters, where clerks transcribed depositions from Japanese prisoners. Most of them were aircrew shot down over the Solomons, gunners, navigators, a few junior pilots. Lieutenant Colonel Matthews, the head of the intelligence section, met me at the door. He was a man of grey eyes and constant motion. "We've got a few flyers who might help explain your bomber," he said, handing me a folder stamped ATIS Captured Personnel Interrogation Report. "They flew the G4M. Maybe they can tell us why it was built that way." The first interview was held that afternoon. The prisoner, recorded as Warrant Officer Masaru Nakai, was 26 years old, short and thin. He had been a navigator aboard a Betty shot down off Kolombangara in July. A translator from the 5th Interpreter section sat between us, his diction careful and cold. Nakai bowed slightly before sitting. His uniform had been laundered, his wounds healed. He spoke without defiance, but there was a remoteness in his eyes, as if part of him still hovered somewhere above the sea where his plane had burned. I began simply. "You flew the Type 1 attack bomber?" "Yes," came the answer through the translator. "For the 705th Air Group. Rabaul." "What did you think of the aircraft?" A pause. Then a faint smile. "Fast. Long-legged. Like a bird with no fear." I flipped through the folder. "It had no self-sealing tanks, no armor. Did you know this?" He nodded. "We knew." "Then why? Why would your engineers send you into combat with no protection?" The translator repeated the question in Japanese. Nakai's answer came quickly, firm, and almost proud. "Because protection slows the wings. Our duty was to reach the enemy, not to survive him." I looked at him for a long moment. The room was silent except for the hum of the fan. There was no bravado in his tone, only conviction, the kind of conviction that made men fly willingly into gunfire. Later that night, I reviewed the transcript. Every word matched what we had suspected. The Betty's weaknesses were not mistakes but philosophy. To the Imperial Japanese Navy, range was the highest virtue. Survival was secondary. The next day brought another prisoner. Flight Petty Officer 2nd Class Hiroshi Watanabe, a rear gunner from the same unit. His testimony was more hesitant, his English surprisingly clear. He described the same aircraft, its long wings, its speed, the thin aluminum that sang in flight. "The G4M was like a paper kite," he said softly. "We could see sunlight through the fuselage when flying low." "Did you ever ask why it wasn't armored?" I asked. He shrugged. "We had been told armor is for those who plan to be hit." "We did not plan to be hit." There was no arrogance in it, just doctrine. He went on to describe missions, long-range raids from Rabaul to Guadalcanal, flights that lasted 10 hours, the constant dread of P-38 seconds appearing out of nowhere. When they came, he said, it was like being hunted by lightning. Watanabe described how tracer rounds would pierce the wings and ignite fuel instantly. "It was beautiful for 1 second, he murmured, eyes unfocused. Then nothing. By the time the session ended, even the interpreter was silent. I sent both reports to Colonel Matthews with a note. "Enemy. Pilots acknowledge absence of self-sealing tanks as intentional design trade-off for extended range." Cultural and doctrinal adherence to offensive spirit overrides concern for survivability. He read it, nodded once, and said, "That's the Japanese Navy in one sentence." Over the next week, I reviewed dozens of other transcripts, some captured documents, some post-action interrogations. Patterns emerged. The same reasoning echoed through every account: range, speed, purity of attack. Protection was seen as cowardice. A quote from one translated officer's manual struck me: "Armor is a weight upon the warrior's spirit." I began to understand that what we saw as recklessness, they saw as faith. The Betty was not designed by engineers alone, it was shaped by ideology. In the evenings, I walked the perimeter of the compound. The sea breeze carried the smell of oil and coral. Beyond the fence, the silhouettes of Catalinas rested on the dark water, their hulls gleaming faintly in the moonlight. Somewhere in the darkness beyond lay Rabaul, still active, still sending out bombers into the same sky. One night, a marine interpreter named Carter joined me on the walk. He had spent months interrogating Japanese officers. "You know," he said, "they don't see death the way we do. When a Betty goes down, it's not a failure, it's fulfillment." "Fulfillment?" I asked. "Yeah, they think dying in the act of attack is the highest success. You don't armor success." He lit a cigarette, the flame briefly lighting his face. "Hell of a way to build airplanes, though." A few days later, we received a packet from the Air Force Historical Research Section, a copy of the captured Japanese 4th Air Group War Diary. Among its entries was a chillingly simple line dated the 14th of January 1943. 2 bombers lost in flames over Guadalcanal. Crews did not return. Spirits are praised for their loyalty. No mention of loss, no grief, just reverence. I closed the file and looked out across the compound where the prisoners slept. The night was quiet, except for the distant surf. For a moment, I could almost hear the hum of engines, the faint echo of bombers passing overhead, their tanks full, their wings light, their fates already decided. The next morning, Matthews summoned me. "Washington wants a synthesis report," he said. "They're compiling data for the Air Technical Intelligence Unit. They want to understand the psychology behind Japanese design." So I wrote it page after page, the words stark against the white paper. The G4M's lack of protection is not due to material shortage, but design doctrine. Japanese naval aviation prioritizes range and striking power over pilot survivability. This reflects a broader cultural and strategic philosophy. Victory through offense, not endurance. The aircraft's vulnerabilities are accepted as honorable risks rather than technical deficiencies. When I finished, I realized what disturbed me most. They had built their machines the way they lived, fast, fatalistic, consumed by purpose. That evening, I visited the prisoners' quarters one last time. Nakai sat near the fence, sketching the outline of a bomber in the dirt. When he saw me, he nodded politely. I asked what he was drawing. He smiled faintly. "A Betty," he said. "She had long wings, beautiful wings." Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "but too easy to burn." He brushed his hand across the drawing, erasing it. I walked away with the wind rustling through the palms, thinking of how fragile the line was between devotion and destruction, and how, in war, that line is often drawn in aluminum. By mid-September, the crated G4M had been reassembled under the watchful eyes of engineers from the 13 Fighter Command's Air Technical Intelligence Unit. The tropical humidity clung to every surface, making the smell of oil, aluminum, and sweat almost unbearable. The purpose of this meticulous reconstruction was clear: to understand the bomber not as a machine, but as a statement of philosophy and engineering priorities. Lieutenant James McAllister, a young P-38 pilot newly assigned to intelligence duties, crouched beside the fuselage with his notebook. He tapped the aluminum skin, tracing a path along the seam of a wing. "I still don't get it," he muttered. "Look at these tanks, nothing around them, no sealant. If a 50 cal hits that, the whole plane goes up in flames." "Exactly," said Major Harold Evers, the senior engineer. "That's what baffles us. The Japanese knew perfectly well what they were doing. They had the capability to install self-sealing tanks. They had it in the Key 21 and other designs, but they didn't. Not even in the Type 1. I stood back and let them speak. The room was filled with the quiet hum of electricity, typewriters, and occasional hammers as small repairs were made for inspection purposes. The cockpit canopy had been carefully cleaned, enough to read the original Japanese labels. Instrument panels showed wear from repeated missions, switches scorched by gunfire or heat. Yet remarkably, many gauges were still functional. The philosophy is clear once you start looking at the trade-offs, Evers continued. Every ounce of weight saved went directly into fuel or range. Range was the prime requirement. They wanted to strike at distant targets, Guadalcanal, Port Moresby, even the Solomons chain. Survival wasn't a requirement, reaching the target was. McAllister scribbled notes furiously. But it's suicide. You're sending men into combat, knowing their aircraft could ignite from a single hit. Our P-38 seconds, yeah. We take risks, but we have self-sealing tanks, armor plates, redundancy in the systems. Why wouldn't they protect themselves? Evers shrugged. It's not just technical, it's doctrinal. They believed skill and daring could mitigate vulnerability. Armor is heavy, slows climb, reduces maneuverability, shortens range. For the G4M, every gram of armor was considered a liability against their offensive doctrine. We moved along the fuselage to inspect the fuel system itself. The main wing tanks had no lining. The auxiliary tank behind the cockpit, a small, cylindrical bladder, was nothing more than thin aluminum. I ran my hand along it carefully. It felt almost fragile, so thin that even handling it improperly risked puncture. This, McAllister said, shaking his head, is the equivalent of strapping a fuse to the airplane. And yet, Evers added, they flew these missions across hundreds of miles of open water. They survived P-38 intercepts, sometimes even bringing bombers back with serious damage. Their aircraft were fast, stable, and astonishingly capable of long missions at full load. We documented every detail: measurements, material composition, wiring schematics, even rivet spacing. Every page of our report emphasized the juxtaposition. The G4M was a marvel of range engineering and aerodynamic efficiency, yet catastrophically fragile under fire. One section of the report included notes from pilots who had faced Betty bombers in combat. They described seeing the aircraft hit and igniting instantly, the crew rarely surviving. We couldn't understand how they expected anyone to make it home, one P-38 pilot wrote. But when they did, the efficiency of the machine and the skill of the crew were undeniable. By the end of the week, our report, meticulous, factual, and full of diagrams, was ready to be sent to Washington. The conclusions were stark. The G4M's lack of self-sealing tanks was intentional, not a design oversight. Its design prioritized range and speed above all else, and American intelligence and tactics would need to account for both its fragility and its reach. As I closed the final folder, McAllister looked at me quietly. "It's beautiful in a way," he said. "Terrifying, but beautiful. You can see exactly what they valued: offense over defense, range over survival. It's like reading their minds." Evers nodded. "Exactly. And that understanding will save lives. Knowing why they built it this way lets us anticipate what they'll do next. We don't just study machines, we study the men who built and flew them." Outside, the sun glinted off the reassembled fuselage. The Betty, stripped bare and examined inch by inch, lay under tarpaulins. To us, it was both a weapon and a window into a mindset that valued mission above mortality. A dangerous lesson we would carry into the skies over the Solomons. With the technical report complete, our focus shifted from analysis to application. The G4M's vulnerabilities were well documented, but understanding them on paper was one thing. Translating that understanding into combat tactics was another. A small team of intelligence officers, engineers, and P-38 pilots convened in a makeshift briefing room above the airstrip. Maps of the Solomon Islands, hand-drawn profiles of the Betty's structure, and photographs of the captured aircraft adorned the walls. Major Harold Evers began, pointing to a cross-section of the wing. "Here's the critical takeaway. The fuel tanks are completely unprotected. Hits in this area are almost always catastrophic. We can exploit that, but only if we control the engagement distance. Lieutenant James McAllister, still awed by the aircraft's design, furrowed his brow. So we don't go head-on, we don't try to dogfight. Straight attacks on the fuselage and wing routes? Precisely, Evers confirmed. The P-38's concentrated, 50 caliber fire is perfect for this. High-speed slashing attacks, not turning fights. Dive from above, aim for the tanks or engine nacelles, then pull up before their defensive gunners can respond effectively. Think of it as precision over brute force. The pilots listened, some nodding, others scribbling notes, as if their lives depended on it because they did. The Betty had killed more American airmen in 1942 and early 1943 than almost any other enemy aircraft, despite its fragility. Its combination of range and defensive gunners made intercepting it over open water a lethal proposition. We moved outside for practical application. 2 P-38 seconds were assigned to simulate interceptions. Using the captured Betty as a static target, the pilots practiced approach angles, target prioritization, and attack sequencing. "It's so light-looking," he muttered, "but it carries a ton of fuel. One hit, and it's gone." "Exactly," Evers said. "Weight reduction gave them range, but also created our window. Our goal is to maximize firepower while minimizing exposure to their guns. Don't linger. Hit hard, hit fast, and get out." The simulation began. P-38 seconds dove from altitude, throttles wide open. Each pass emphasized the mechanics outlined in the report: speed, angle, and precision. Observers timed the attacks and recorded hit placements with chalk markings on the Betty's fuselage. The results were immediate. Concentrated bursts to the wing root and fuselage near the fuel tanks consistently destroyed the target. Hits elsewhere were less effective, sometimes even allowing the aircraft to remain airworthy in simulation. McAllister banked the P-38 and returned to altitude, exhilarated but thoughtful. "It's like we're learning a new language. The Betty's weaknesses are obvious now, but until we experienced them from the cockpit, we wouldn't have known how to use them." Evers nodded. "And remember, this knowledge isn't just theoretical. Soon, every squadron in the Solomons will face these bombers. Every lesson we learn here could save lives." By evening, the pilots gathered for debriefing. The consensus was clear. Attacking a G4M required respect for its range and defensive fire, but courage and precision could turn its greatest strength endurance into vulnerability. The static analysis had become actionable intelligence. Outside, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the Betty in long shadows across the grass. To most, it remained a dead bomber, a relic dragged from the mud. To us, it had transformed into a teacher, revealing the lethal intentions of its designers and showing how American ingenuity, training, and tactical application could finally counter a seemingly unstoppable adversary. The morning was humid, the air sticky with the scent of salt and mangroves, as the 339th Fighter Squadron readied their P-38 seconds on the rough coral runway at Espiritu Santo. Intelligence briefings had drilled the lessons from the captured G4M into every pilot, and today those lessons would be tested in combat for the first time. Reports of a small formation of Betty bombers targeting American positions on Bougainville had reached headquarters, and the call to intercept went out immediately. Lieutenant James McAllister taxied his P-38 Lightning to the threshold, engine roaring, his mind reviewing every diagram, photo, and simulation from the past 2 weeks. Behind him, the familiar twin booms of his aircraft reflected the sunlight, a symbol of speed, power, and deadly accuracy. "We know their weaknesses," he murmured, gripping the throttle. "Time to see if they work in the sky." Major Harold Evers led the mission, a formation of 12 P-38 seconds climbing to 20,000 feet, heading north toward the anticipated intercept point. The squadron was silent except for the steady hum of engines, the tension palpable. Every pilot understood that these Betty bombers had previously shattered American airmen with impunity, exploiting range and defensive gunners. Today, the tables would turn. As the formation approached Bougainville, radar and spotters reported the enemy. 4 Betty bombers, flying low over the islands, escorted by 2 Mitsubishi, A6M-0 fighters. McAllister scanned the horizon, seeing the familiar silhouette of the G4M, the long, slender fuselage, the glazed cockpit, and the stubby, unprotected wing tanks, glinting in the morning sun. Target acquired, Evers radioed, calm and precise. Maintain altitude, engage from the sun, boom and zoom only, hit the tanks and engines, no turning fights. Repeat. No turning fights. The squadron split into pairs, each P-38 taking a slightly different vector to confuse the escorting Zeros. McAllister's heart pounded as he positioned himself above the enemy formation. Through his gun sight, he measured distance. 400 yards, optimal convergence range. The first Betty was directly below, engine humming, wing flexing lightly in the breeze. He dove, throttling to maximum, and unleashed a controlled burst of 50 caliber rounds aimed precisely at the fuselage, just behind the wing root. The tracer streams hit the unprotected fuel tank, and immediately, black smoke erupted, followed by a burst of flames. The bomber shuddered violently, the port engine catching fire. McAllister pulled up sharply, climbing back to altitude before the defensive gunners could adjust. Nicely done, Evers radioed. Keep moving, don't linger, target the others. The second pass targeted the trailing Betty, firing a combination of long and short bursts at the wing tanks. The results were consistent, the fuel ignited, and the aircraft began losing altitude rapidly. McAllister watched as the bomber, engulfed in fire, banked hard toward the sea. The simulation had translated perfectly into reality. The Zero escorts reacted too late, attempting to chase the P-38 seconds into maneuvers they could not match. McAllister noticed one pursuing him, attempting to turn inside his plane. Using the P-38's superior speed and climb, he rolled inverted and dove past, the Zero struggling to follow. With precise deflection shooting, he fired at the escort's engine, cowling, and the Japanese fighter wavered, smoke trailing from the exhaust before peeling away in retreat. By the end of the engagement, all 4 Betty bombers were destroyed, 3 crashing into the ocean, 1 attempting to reach land before breaking apart. None of the American aircraft were lost. The mission lasted just under 20 minutes, yet it marked a decisive turning point in tactical understanding of Japanese bomber vulnerabilities. Back at Espiritu Santo, the pilots debriefed, exhilarated but methodical. The simulations were accurate, Evers said, referencing photographs of the captured Betty. The unprotected fuel tanks are catastrophic if targeted correctly. The P-38's firepower and approach angles allow us to exploit that fully. This is exactly what we needed to know before engaging larger formations. Lieutenant McAllister, still buzzing from the encounter, examined the post-mission photographs taken by a wing-mounted camera. The tracers had struck precisely where predicted: the wing roots, the engine nacelles, the fuselage near the fuel tanks. The aircraft were utterly destroyed, confirming every hypothesis. "I've never felt so effective in combat," he admitted. "We're not just surviving, we're dominating." Intelligence officers noted every detail, sending reports to 13 Fighter Command headquarters. The lessons from the captured aircraft were now codified into operational directives. Always engage from above, avoid turning engagements, prioritize fuel tanks and engines, and withdraw immediately after firing. These protocols would form the basis of subsequent P-38 intercept tactics across the Pacific theater. The impact of the mission extended beyond immediate kills. Japanese command, based on post-war interrogation reports and contemporaneous war diaries, later expressed shock at the efficacy of these small formations of P-38 seconds. Pilots who had once relied on speed, surprise, and range for survival now found themselves facing aircraft that could dictate the terms of engagement, exploit known vulnerabilities, and retreat before effective counterfire could be delivered. By nightfall, Guadalcanal's airfields buzzed with reports. Engineers continued examining the captured Betty, comparing battle damage to what the pilots had observed. For the first time, American forces understood the true limitations of this Japanese bomber and how to systematically exploit them. The combination of intelligence, training, and superior tactics had turned a once-feared adversary into a predictable target. As McAllister sat in the briefing room later that evening, he reflected on the lesson learned. Machines are tools, but knowledge is the ultimate weapon. The Betty had once been untouchable, its design and range inspiring dread. Now, understood fully, it had become a guide, teaching American pilots how to strike decisively and survive. The quiet satisfaction in the room was palpable today. The P-38 seconds had truly begun to tip the balance in the Pacific skies. The lessons learned from the first successful P-38 interceptions against Betty bombers over Bougainville were fast becoming the foundation of a broader tactical doctrine across the 13 Fighter Command. Intelligence officers at Espiritu Santo and Henderson Field meticulously compiled every detail from combat reports, photographs, and gun camera footage. The analyses revealed patterns that were as precise as they were devastating. The G4M's unprotected fuel tanks were a fatal vulnerability, its defensive firepower inadequate against high-speed, altitude-advantaged attackers, and the crew's survival depended almost entirely on range and escape rather than armor or maneuverability. Major Harold Evers convened a briefing for squadron leaders in late November 1943. The room was filled with veteran P-38 pilots, their youthful faces etched with the tension and fatigue of combat, and a handful of intelligence officers whose eyes gleamed with analytical rigor. On the projector, grainy photographs of a destroyed Betty flashed repeatedly, black smoke curling from wing tanks, engines shredded, fuselages ripped apart by the convergence of 50 caliber rounds. "Gentlemen," Evers began, voice clipped but precise, "what we've seen is a predictable machine. The G4M is fast and long-legged, but it cannot withstand concentrated fire in critical areas. We now know where to strike, how to strike, and, most importantly, when to disengage." The pilots nodded, reviewing the tactical overlays drawn directly from intelligence reports. Dive angles, deflection shooting ranges, and firing bursts were annotated in precise detail. The doctrine emphasized energy management. Dive from high altitude, release a short but deadly burst aimed at fuel tanks or engine nacelles, and then climb back to regain altitude before the escort could react. Turning engagements were strictly forbidden. Any pilot who attempted to dogfight a Zero in a P-38 was risking catastrophic loss. Lieutenant James McAllister, who had flown the first successful interception, shared his experience. "When we dive from 20,000 feet, the P-38's speed and firepower allow us to hit critical areas instantly. The G4M doesn't absorb punishment, one proper hit, and it's gone. I cannot stress enough. Focus on the tanks, engines, and fuselage only if tanks are inaccessible. Avoid prolonged engagement. Trust the Lightning's acceleration and climb." Technical officers, including Captain Frederick Hayes, reinforced the practical lessons learned from the captured Betty. The Japanese did not armor the wing tanks. They relied on speed and range for protection. Our P-38 seconds exploit that perfectly. Every sortie now requires pre-mission coordination to ensure that no pilot engages without situational awareness of both enemy position and altitude advantage. Coordination is just as important as firepower. By early December, these doctrines were disseminated to other squadrons across the Solomons. Pilots trained in simulated strikes against mock-ups of the G4M, reproducing the unarmored fuel tanks with mock panels of aluminum and rubber. At Espiritu Santo and Henderson Field, training airfields buzzed with exercises in boom and zoom tactics, coordinated climbs, and high-speed dives. Pilots practiced deflection shooting relentlessly, aiming for the exact zones identified during intelligence analysis. The results were immediate in combat. On the 14th of December 1943, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Bob Mercer led a dozen P-38 seconds from the 339th Fighter Squadron to intercept a small Betty formation attempting a strike on New Georgia airfields. Employing the newly codified doctrine, Mercer's squadron dived from 21,500 feet, firing controlled bursts aimed at wing roots and engine nacelles. Within minutes, 2 bombers were ablaze, the third losing altitude rapidly. None of Mercer's aircraft suffered damage. Post-mission analysis confirmed near-perfect execution. Every round had struck the intended target zones. Japanese observers, both in flight and on the ground, recorded the effectiveness with increasing alarm. Post-war interrogations of 4th Air Group personnel revealed disbelief. Pilots had assumed the Americans were either reckless or extraordinarily lucky. They could not understand how small formations of P-38 seconds were systematically destroying aircraft that had previously dominated the air with impunity. "Their planes come from above," wrote one Japanese pilot in a diary recovered by ATIS, "and fire streams of bullets that cannot be evaded. We try to flee, but even range is no protection. One hit, one fire, and we fall." The U.S. intelligence officers noted that understanding enemy design philosophy was as critical as understanding firepower. The G4M's designers had deliberately prioritized range and speed over crew survivability, a trade-off that made sense in strategic doctrine but proved fatal when confronted with concentrated firepower and altitude advantage. By studying the captured aircraft, engineers and pilots alike recognized that enemy tactics were optimized for a different operational paradigm, one in which unarmored bombers could rely on distance and maneuver. The P-38 seconds had rewritten that paradigm. During the weeks that followed, 13 Fighter Command integrated these lessons into large-scale operational planning. Interception protocols included assigning altitude sectors to pairs of P-38 seconds, coordinating with radar installations and timing dives to coincide with the enemy's approach from open ocean or through narrow straits, where escape was limited. Photographs and intelligence assessments of Japanese formations guided every sortie. Fuel tanks were primary targets, fuselage next, and defensive gunners neutralized by altitude and speed advantage. Training extended beyond the Solomons. At Espiritu Santo, mock strafing runs and photographic reconnaissance exercises reinforced precision and situational awareness. P-38 pilots were taught to anticipate enemy evasive maneuvers and calculate deflection angles on the fly. Intelligence officers continually updated combat guides, adding new observations from each sortie. By January 1944, the doctrine was codified into a 40-page manual distributed to squadrons operating across the Pacific. The operational effect was profound. In the subsequent month, Japanese bomber losses increased dramatically. Small formations attempting strikes on Bougainville, New Georgia, and Treasury Islands suffered devastating attrition. The G4M, once feared for its long-range capability and heavy bomb load, became predictable and fragile. In post-mission debriefings, pilots described a near-mechanical process: climb, dive, fire, and climb again. "It became almost scientific," McAllister later recalled. "We knew exactly where to strike, and the plane did exactly what we expected. No surprises." By late January 1944, Japanese commanders were forced to consider their approach. Intercepting American positions without escort became almost suicidal. Long-range strikes were increasingly postponed or cancelled, and formations that did fly were reduced in size to minimize losses. The psychological effect was equally pronounced. Pilots reported increasing fear when P-38 seconds appeared overhead. Intelligence assessments from 13 Fighter Command noted rising levels of anxiety and disorganization in Japanese bomber crews, corroborated by post-war diaries and interrogation reports. Through a combination of captured enemy technology, careful analysis, and disciplined tactical innovation, the U.S. forces had transformed a single, vulnerable engagement into a doctrinal framework with strategic impact. The P-38 Lightning, guided by intelligence from the captured Betty, was no longer merely a fighter. It had become a tool to systematically neutralize a previously formidable threat. Every pilot who climbed into a Lightning now carried not just ammunition, but knowledge, precision, and the deadly certainty of exploiting enemy weaknesses. The stage was set for the next phase, scaling the doctrine to confront larger Japanese formations, integrating fighter coordination with naval and ground operations, and ultimately preparing for the aerial battles that would define the Solomons campaign in 1944. The captured Betty had taught the Americans one lesson above all. To understand the enemy completely was to dominate him entirely. What began as a single interrogation, a stripped fuselage and a handful of pilot reports, matured into doctrine that reshaped aerial operations across the South Pacific. By February 1944, the tactical adjustments developed at Espiritu Santo and Henderson Field high-altitude advantage, boom and zoom attacks, prioritized strikes on wing routes and fuel cells were standard operating procedure for every P-38 unit assigned to interception duty. The transition from local improvisation to theater-wide practice was neither instantaneous nor effortless. It required logistics, training, and coordination on a scale only a functioning industrial air force could sustain. 13 Fighter Command distributed the 40-page tactical manual through radio dispatches and couriered packets. The manual was lean and direct. Diagrams of strike angles, standard burst lengths for 50 caliber batteries, an altitude sector grid for pair and four-plane elements, procedures for disengagement, and a prioritized hit list tanks, nacelles, fuselage. It emphasized communication, discipline, and the annihilation of indecision. Do not engage in turning fights. Read one memorized line that would save lives. The manual also included a section on mission recovery and salvage. Procedures for photographing downed enemy aircraft, recovering ordnance fragments, and forwarding technical intelligence to the Air Technical Intelligence Unit. Training scaled to match the doctrine. Squadrons rotated through intensive 2-week blocks dedicated to mock intercepts over water, simulated escort harassment, and live gunnery practice using tow targets and camera guns. Gun camera footage was reviewed nightly, hits counted, ranges measured, mistakes annotated. P-38 mechanics and armourers learned to replace ammunition belts and service guns in minutes. Pilots learned to trust a rhythm climb, dive, burst climb that reduced exposure to defensive gunners to the minimum. Coordination with naval radar pickets and Coast Watcher reports became routine. Interception windows were now choreographed to the minute so that P-38 formations could appear from above at optimal vectors. The operational effect was immediate and measurable. Between March and May 1944, Japanese records later captured and catalogued by Allied translation units showed a marked increase in bomber losses during transit over the Solomons and the northern approaches to New Guinea. Small Japanese strike packages that once returned with heavy bomb loads began to suffer attrition rates incompatible with sustained offensive operations. The G4M, so long an instrument of reach, became a liability once enemy fighters could reliably exploit its unarmored tanks. To counter the new American tactics, Japanese command attempted a series of adjustments. Escorts were increased where possible, more zeros per bomber, but this trade-off reduced available offensive fighter screens elsewhere. Night raids and low-altitude approaches were reintroduced in limited sectors, but these carried their own hazards. Navigation over featureless sea at night, increased risk of anti-aircraft fire when approaching nearer to the target, and diminished accuracy. Japanese production efforts scrambled to alter tactics and equipment. Later war diaries and interrogation transcripts note attempts to modify filler compounds and increase local protection, but by 1944 shortages and industrial constraints made wholesale redesign impossible. The doctrine, that had produced the G4M range at nearly any cost, was now an operational straitjacket. The Americans built on success by integrating P-38 intercepts into larger operational frameworks. Fighter sweeps were coordinated with aerial reconnaissance, naval interdiction, and shore-based anti-aircraft deployments. When heavy raids threatened island airfields or supply convoys, P-38 seconds were positioned to intercept at choke points, narrows between islands, approaches over reef lines, where Japanese bombers could not easily jettison ordnance and run. In several notable campaigns in April and May, coordinated strike packages delivered crippling blows to Japanese supply lines, destroying transports, fuel barges, and staging aircraft on the ground. The tactical doctrine derived from a single captured Betty had multiplied into strategic effects, reduced enemy mobility, impaired resupply, and a forced contraction of operational reach. Logistics underpinned this scaling. Demanded fuel, spare parts, and trained pilots. These demands were met by an American industrial system operating at wartime tempo. Replacement aircraft moved forward from stateside depots, while the Lake City and other arsenals kept ammunition flowing. Where the Japanese design had accepted loss as an operational constant, the American approach internalized replacement into strategy. Expendable materiel could be tolerated because production and training could restore losses. Another mirror of industrial philosophy evident in captured technical reports. The psychological consequences were as significant as the material ones. Japanese aircrews, once confident in the deterrent value of range and evasive routing, reported rising anxiety when P-38 seconds appeared overhead. Interrogation reports captured after the war record phrases repeated by multiple pilots. Shock at the concentration of American fire, dread of the high-altitude dives, and the sense that the calculated reflex of their doctrine had been turned against them. On the American side, pilots described a growing competence and calm. What had begun as improvisation hardened into reflex. "We climbed to them like the sun," one pilot later reflected. "We hit where they could not take punishment." It became routine, and routine is how wars are won. By June 1944, the cumulative effect was unmistakable. Japanese bomber sorties over contested waters decreased in frequency. Those that did fly were smaller, more cautious, and more likely to abort. The G4M continued to operate in theaters where range remained the only option, but its effectiveness as a decisive strike platform had been severely curtailed. Air superiority, once contested, had passed decisively to Allied fighters in many sectors of the Pacific. The final archival note on the captured Betty's influence is bureaucratic and unromantic. The technical files that began in a mudflat at Vella La Vella became reference documents at Wright Field and in the Air Technical Intelligence Unit. Engineers and tacticians referenced these files for months, informing both aircraft design and combat doctrine. The Betty itself, after months of study, was crated and sent piecemeal to a mainland depot for further analysis. Its metal would be inspected, its components catalogued, and eventually disposed of. In reports and lectures that followed the war, instructors used the case as a textbook example. Match tactics to enemy design, exploit vulnerability with speed and precision, integrate intelligence, training, and logistics. In the end, the story of the captured Betty is less about a single aircraft than about the mechanics of adaptation. The Japanese had built a machine that reflected their strategic calculus. The Americans used that reflection to see farther into enemy intent. The P-38 seconds had not won by chance or brute force alone. They had applied knowledge, technical, tactical, and organizational, until theory became practice. Where the Betty exposed a doctrine of sacrifice, American response revealed a doctrine of systems. Identify the enemy's truth, then outstructure it. The Pacific skies, once open to Japanese reach, tightened around their limitations. Knowledge, catalogued and taught, displaced dread. The tools of analysis became the instruments of victory.